Hello and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are coming to you with another episode. This week, it is just going to be myself and Coleman, my fellow co host. My name is Justin Woods, and today we are going to be taking a look into the Empire of Brazil, which, as a brief disclaimer, we are not looking at the entirety of the history of Brazil. We are looking at a specific time period and empire. So I,
Yeah,
I
we
think that's a good
yeah
disclaimer, no?
we are looking at the discovery, big air quotes there, by the Portuguese. So from the first Portuguese encounter up to the end of Brazil's empire, that is a 390-year period of time. So we feel it's fairly expansive and a good chunk of history to go at. And Justin, I just want to say before we begin, I'm very, very happy that you introduced yourself. Otherwise, I was going to have to spend the rest of this broadcast referring to you as myself.
No, no, no. Sometimes I like to mix it up. You can't
I,
just keep doing the same formula, even though I start every
yeah,
episode the same. There's some slight
yeah.
variation.
All
But, like,
right. So,
yeah.
okay, sorry. Yeah. I'm just gonna dive. I'm just gonna dive right in because we have a lot of history for you folks today. So to start off with, to understand the Empire of Brazil, we need to understand how Brazil first was a colony, this of the Portuguese. Now, Brazil officially, and I need to stress the word officially, was first discovered by the Portuguese on April 22nd of the year 1500 in an armada under Pedro Alvarez Cabral. Apologies for mispronouncing his name. Uh, he was attempting to follow the 1498 route around the bottom of Africa and into India. However, there was a what is called a calm, which is a area where there is no wind. And so, in order to avoid this, he ended up sailing west all the way into South America.
Yeah, which is a little bit of an accident, a little bit of an oversight, but I also feel like it's important to mention that that route that he was trying to follow was created by Vasco da Gama, another really prominent sea time explorer who helped map significant portions of the world.
Yeah, maritime. So Cabral and Portugal, as quickly as can be done in those days, stakes a claim to this new landmass south of the Caribbean. And one of the key things here is with this discovery, there is some debate as to whether Cabral was the first Portuguese to find this. There is some claim that a Portuguese ship under one of Columbus's fleets also sailed down to Brazil and technically discovered it first, but there wasn't really a lot to confirm these reports in the research I could find beyond just general conspiracy theory nonsense about mass cover-ups by this 600-year-old government.
Oh, but we do love a good conspiracy theory every now and
Yeah,
again.
it was. Yeah, I couldn't find any substance to justify a claim different from the one officially recognized by Brazil. So we will be using that date for those of you that disagree with us.
And if you do disagree, be sure to leave a comment down below and let us know. We really appreciate all of the love support comments, but we love the hate comments. So leave a hate message. Tell us where we're wrong.
Don't make it a hate message. Just show, tell us what you think. There's no need to be uncivil
It's the
for
internet.
anything. I know they're going to do it anyway. Don't encourage it. We are in a position of power here. We must curate. All right.
See, I thought you're just supposed to rile up the masses. You're supposed to encourage it.
Not now, Donald.
Oh no!
There we go.
On that note, let's continue on with the pod.
Yes, please, before we kill each other.
Oh.
uh, so, one very fun fact is at this time, Portugal had a legal claim to Brazil from a 1494 treaty called the Treaty of Tordesillas. Um, Tordesillas was a treaty negotiated by the papacy, by the Catholic Church, between the nations of Spain and Portugal on who could own what in the New World. This was done as an effort to keep them from fighting and to potentially keep other people from rushing in and trying to claim what is essentially two whole continents. This
Yeah.
claim, the right of this claim, was recognized exclusively by Spain and Portugal, and absolutely no one else cared.
Yeah, I was gonna say because especially in South America, that's all you really saw was Portugal and Spain. Spain made it as far as North America, like they made it through a lot of Western
Yeah,
United States, but their whole thing was just Central America predominantly,
yeah.
and then
They the thing with Spain was just once news was out of the bag about this whole New World thing, it was a race to claim it, and Spain did a decent, was able to claim a decent sized chunk of territory, but they were starting in the Caribbean and they moved sort of in and around that area. And by the time it came for them to move, say, up the Mississippi River or along the eastern seaboard, the British and the French were just already there, and it really wasn't worth another war.
plus they had most of paradise. Like when you got the Caribbean in your control, I don't think you're really concerned about much else. They were on island time.
Please comment if you know exactly why the Spanish were on island time during this period.
No necesito. Oh no. Oh, and now you're inciting the masses.
What goes around comes around, my friend. So, what this Treaty of Tordesillas said was that any territory in the New World east of 48 degrees west longitude was the property of Portugal. And the budding edge of Brazil pokes out past that barrier. So, Brazil belongs to Portugal. Portugal will then disregard the Treaty of Tordesillas in everything else it does.
As a good conquering army should. They should just ignore any sort
Yeah.
of treaty.
So, yeah. Yeah, they just Portugal and Brazil just sort of ignore their own treaty for the most part. It's hilarious. They originally tried to name this place Vera Cruz, which means true cross, but it doesn't stick because for the longest time, the only thing that comes out of Brazil is Brazil wood, which is used to make a very profitable red dye. And so it just becomes called Brazil because Portugal just literally sets up a lumber yard and walks away.
Which, to be fair, there wasn't a whole lot of infrastructure and there wasn't enough time or effort dedicated towards identifying other valuable resources. As time will tell, and as hindsight is always 2020, Brazil has a lot of natural resources beyond just the wood.
Yeah. Uh, after this, uh, so after this initial discovery, the Portuguese commissioned the Italian navigator. You'll notice there's a lot of them running around at this time
It's
in
almost
history.
like the Italians were the best at sailing, you know. Cristobal Colon, Christopher Columbus was a good old Italian
It's yeah,
boy.
yeah. There's a lot of them. This
Yeah.
one was Amerigo Vespucci, whose name might sound familiar to some who,
That sounds
as
familiar.
it lends itself to two continents,
Oh, Europe and
making
Australia?
making him perhaps the man to have the most land ever named after him, beating
Washington
out the
has nothing.
previous claimant, Alexander the Great, and Queen Victoria.
Yeah. Jeez, that's yeah, no, that's a good point. Like Amerigo Vespucci and I just still can't get over the fact that Italy had so many prominent navigators. Like obviously they were the
They,
heart of the
well,
Renaissance and they had a lot of the top tier technology, mapping skills, like tools
the
to do it.
the biggest thing for Italy was around this time, Italy's strongest uh, I guess these city states would be the best term for them, are maritime traders, the Florentines and the Venetians.
Oh yeah, I forgot. Venice is
And
pretty.
and and in addition to that, Italy is currently the center of higher education. It's where all the universities are. We talk about this some in our episode on Copernicus, where a Polish astronomer who goes to Italy to actually learn astronomy, because it's just where the universities are at this point in history. They spread quickly into the other nations, but it's where the big ones are at this time. They fall by the wayside. For the most part, they get supplanted by things like Oxford and other countries, but the original universities are currently just in Italy. So all the
Which
Italians do the navigating.
which will also link to the Copernicus episode down in the description below. Be sure to check that one out. That one's kind of interesting.
Yep.
There's a lot of fun facts about that fellow.
Yep. Yeah, so Vespucci maps out the Brazilian coast, and he does this by sailing, stopping for a day, walking out onto the shore, and baptizing it with the name of whichever Catholic saint's day it happens to be. And for those of you that are in doubt that there could be enough Catholic saints to fill the full 365 days of the calendar, let me assure you, many of them share.
Oh, jeez, yeah.
You have your pick of the litter on any given day of the year. So this was not a hard task that this man set for himself.
I just like the fact that it's like baptize various parts, not just bless, baptize.
Yeah, well, it's baptized because you are effectively christening the land as a means of saying no one lives here. We are the first people to ever see it. Ignore the village. It is a wonderful way to create your own imaginary clean slate to do whatever you want with a place.
And let me guess, Portugal takes note of this, and then they begin really caring for the land, really paying attention to Brazil, and really trying to establish colonies there, right?
No, they ignore it. They
Oh,
immediately
okay.
abandon the colony. What they do instead is they just sort of let the other European powers encroach on what is technically their territory. They spend most of their time focusing on trying to deal with the East Indies and Asia and trying to get a share of that market over there. That's where the money is. That's where the spices are at this time for Portugal. What the Portuguese do with Brazil is every now and then some boats come by to some prearranged ports that they have mapped out, and they barter with the native people for wood.
Which the
And
areas that they're fighting for in the East Indies, by the way, is the now Chinese city of Macau, which is very similar to Hong Kong and was established.
yeah, yeah, it was a lot of those places. And it's not till we get to John III of Portugal, who ruled from 1521 to 1557, that Portugal really starts to zero in on Brazil. John realizes that he has a massive land claim here that is just gone to waste for the entirety of his predecessor's reign, and decides that, you know what, it's time to establish a government. So he creates the government of Brazil in 1533, because 33 years of anarchy uh, is great for everyone.
You know, at least it may not have been right away, but at least they came to it at some point. Like, we'll get to it. It's not our priority, but we'll get to it.
Yeah. And on the slightly more political note, the fact that Brazil went 33 years without anyone from Europe attempting to government shows you just how necessary this government was.
Well, don't you
Not
know
at
that
all.
those indigenous
Don't
communities
say
that
it.
were there,
Don't say it.
they were self-sustaining. It's almost
Yes.
like they had their own systems that were equally as efficient
Yep.
and worked for the type of environment in which they lived.
Oh, equally as efficient? No, no, no. Things are about to go wrong for Portugal. You see, what John does is he establishes 15 hereditary captaincies or fiefs to persons favored by the crown. basically, if he liked you, he gave you 1/15 of Brazil.
Good deal.
Um, each of these captaincies encompassed 160 miles or 260 kilometers of coastline and effectively extended until you hit the Pacific Ocean.
Wow.
This is where they immediately decide to ignore the Treaty of Tordesillas, which puts that nice little barrier running down the middle of South America on what they can claim.
It, also, I think it's really important that it mentions each fief can encompassed 160 miles of shoreline because in this day and age it was very difficult to traverse over land. It was significantly easier to land at the coast. So by giving them each a chunk of coastline, it made sure that they were able to build ports, that they were able to build cities along the water.
And in theory, it puts them all on equal footing. In reality, Brazil is massive, and several of these places are in rather horrible conditions to try and start a coastal trading economic hyper capitalist empire. Because
Yeah.
of these 15 fiefs, only 2 actually end up working out. Yeah. Let's be honest, that's a worse batting average than the Chicago Cubs pitcher.
Oh, 2 for 15. That's not the worst odds.
I
That's
said
like a
that's
1 in 5.5.
I don't know, you're batting like 200 at that point.
Hey,
I'm
that
not
could be
I'm not
consistent.
I'm not doing the math for this. The 2 that were successful was Sao Vicente, and we apologize for all the mispronunciations we're about to do, which
St.
is part
Vincent,
which is part of the state of Sao Paulo.
Sao Paulo.
Thank you. And the fiefdom that was Pernambuco.
Hmm.
Uh, Vicente was successful because it was one of the few places that had farmland and a safe
Ooh.
port to go with it.
So you mean an easily defensible port and an area where you can grow and self-sustain food?
Not defensible, just safe from the elements.
You're defending against the elements when you're sailing in the Pacific. Or Atlantic. Wow,
This
that
is
was
the
the
Atlantic.
stupidest thing
This is
I've
the
ever said.
Atlantic. This is
All
the
right.
Atlantic.
Freudian slip, my
Someone is
bad.
on the reverse Earth map.
Hashtag reverse Earth.
Yep. And Pernambuco was happened to be a region. Its first captain had the foresight of seeing could produce sugar in mass, and thus began the plantation economy of Brazil. God help us,
Gee,
because
what would
because
plantations really do well
yeah,
with?
because guess what, Justin? And
Huh.
I'm not saying that this wouldn't have happened by independent adventure by other means, but this does come up here. Pernambuco has the distinguishment of being history's first successful plantation economy.
Oh. Now, for those of you playing at home, would you like to explain what a plantation based economy consists of? Or what
Well,
they take
Brazil.
advantage of?
Well, Pernambuco, the prize goes to you because you managed to successfully prove that importing massive amounts of, shall we say, voluntold and forcibly relocated people from Africa into a harsh and bitter agrarian production system was profitable, especially when you don't feed or pay them.
I see. You're cutting out the overhead, so the profitability is through the roof.
Yep. Work people to death, people die, import new people.
And don't pay the people, I think, is the important thing.
Yep. And it worked. The sugar was massively profitable, and plantation economy and the people who own that will dominate Brazil's politics up through the end of the empire, to say the very least.
Wait, are you trying to tell me that money can give you both power and influence in economies and in politics? Is that what you're telling me?
These people dominate for the next 360 years. So yes.
Well, gee, it's a good thing America's not like that. Where
Shut up.
this
Shut
episode's
up.
just been filled with
We are
sarcasm. I'm
we are
sorry.
getting demonetized in every country imaginable. I would like to see some love and support for the things we do. Please, Justin. All right. So John III watches this happen. And in 1549, he realizes that maybe just letting everyone go ham with whatever they want to do isn't a good idea. So he appoints a governor general of Brazil, a man by Tome de Sousa, who, when he arrives in 1549, he establishes the city of Salvador in what is now the state of Bahia, and this becomes the capital of Brazil for 214 years.
Important to note, it is no longer the capital of Brazil.
Yep. Yeah, this is the. Yep. This capital lasts through most of the empire, but not quite all of it. Additionally, Sousa establishes a lot of coastal fortifications to sort of actually defend Portugal's claim to Brazil, and sets up a actual government that is a municipal government similar to what Portugal has at the time, instead of just say letting these 15 captaincies run around as basically pseudo monarchs. They now are actually a government under a single central power.
Interesting.
De Sousa. And De Sousa, he makes a decision here that is going to cause major problems for the next 100 years of Brazilian history.
Oh, jeez.
De Sousa decides that the best way to grow Brazil as a colony is to import a very specific type of labor. The Jesuits.
Oh, no.
See, the Jesuits at this period in time are a religious order that happen to also contain a number of very skilled, self-sufficient ways, seeing as how they are primarily a missionary order, which means they specialize in going out to places where there aren't Christians and making everyone Christian or else.
Yep.
And so he brings in massive amounts of Jesuits who convert and protect the indigenous people. And the way they do this is they arrive, they resettle all the indigenous people they encounter, or as many as they can, into something called an aldeas, which is a sort of a pseudo village. It's similar to the Spanish missions in Spanish America. And what this effectively said was, if you convert to Christianity, you can come live here, and the rest of the Brazilians who had a habit of taking the indigenous people as slaves whenever they felt like it could not touch you, because you are under the protection of the men of God. And that was their big selling point to convert you to Christianity. It was, convert or be enslaved by this crazy Portuguese person over here.
Oh, dear God. So they strong-armed an entire population of people.
They did not strong-arm them. They just allowed the threat of the rest of the Brazilians to work for them.
Yeah, but that's totally a mob tactic.
For it to be strong-arming, I feel the threat has to come from you.
No. That's like the mob threat of if you do not participate in my family's organization, bad things are going to come to you. They're not going to happen from me, but bad things will happen. And I feel like it's that same thing of they are pointing to the Portuguese, going bad things will happen, but that veil of a threat is very apparent.
Look, we're a few hundred years ahead of, or behind the mafioso at this point.
So did the mafioso
or before the mafioso.
The Jesuit.
Let me put it to you this way. The Pope is Italian. The Catholics are Italian. The mafia is Italian. There's a common thread to how things were working at this time. I say that as a full-fledged freaking Catholic. There is some messed up shit in history.
Well, I mean, that's what happens when you're in power for 1,500 years, you know?
Yeah. But anyway, these um these Jesuits and their protection of the indigenous people leads to a lot of building resentment between the Jesuit and non-Jesuit colonists over control of slave labor. The non-Jesuits see the Jesuits as holding out on a valuable resource that should be exploited, and the Jesuits see the non-Jesuits people's hunger uh,
Human flesh.
for I'm going to say forced labor as somewhat unchristian.
Yeah, I think there's a moralistic boundary there that some people would tend to have. But, you know, from the Portuguese perspective, it is just another natural resource of the landscape.
Yeah. This is a prevailing attitude for this part of history. We are not singling out the Portuguese or the Brazilians in any way. This is just the way people thought.
We're just talking about it within the context of this
Yeah.
historical event and within
And
this political
yeah,
context.
yep. And to get back to it, so there is a decree of 1547 that grants the Jesuits, and this is the wording, total control of all indigenous peoples in the aldeas.
But
However, anyone not in an aldeas was fair game for enslavement.
oh,
The
no.
Jesuits, being crafty little buggers at this point in time, take that decree and run with it. They march into the Amazon River basin and just start shelling out aldeas as fast as they can, creating just a pseudo arms race to see who can get to these people first.
God.
And they do this throughout the 17th century. And this creates a massive labor shortage in Brazil. Because guess where those sugar plantations are getting the majority of their people? By kidnapping the neighboring tribesmen.
Oh, God.
So the colonists respond by just mass importing people from Africa.
Well, if we can't get them local, we'll just import them from abroad.
Yep. And this problem is just going to continue to escalate throughout history. However, there are still more problems going on right now for Brazil. Namely, the French have seized control of Rio de Janeiro and have been holding it for the last 12 years. And in 1567, thanks to this new centralized government, Tomé de Sousa is able to push the French out of Brazil. But yeah,
Not bueno. Not a good time.
That gets rid of the French, and shortly thereafter, the Dutch decide that they want a peace. They want to crack at this, and they invade. And the big reason for this is following the rule of John III, starting in 1580 here, about 23 years after his death. The crown of Portugal and Spain is unified under one man, which means anyone who has a bone to pick with Spain now has a nice, easy target in the much less defended Portuguese colonies. And the Dutch had a bone to pick with Spain. So the Dutch launched just a series of incursions into Brazil. They seized Salvador for about a year in 1624. The Dutch West India Company takes control of Pernambuco, that very lucrative plantation economy sugar producing region. They seized that for 24 years, from 1630 to 1654. And the Portuguese do nothing about it.
God, they really are sitting on this gold mine. They're just kind of letting things happen, and these other like really eager companies come in and try and take over.
And here's the thing: the Portuguese Brazilians, the people who were Portuguese, are now effectively, have lived in Brazil for several generations, are now Brazilian. They boot the Dutch out by themselves.
Oh.
And this is the beginning of the second major problem for Portugal's relationship with Brazil, which is the Brazilian people have begun to realize that not only do you not really care about them, they also don't need you to protect them, seeing as how they did it themselves.
Oh no.
This sentiment is going to carry over into the empire of Brazil. However, before we can get there, we have a few more major expansions that happen. First of all, um, there's a group of people called explorers, which a better title would be slave hunter, but they're called explorers.
Gotta be
Uh,
PG about it because we
no,
it's
that
not like
was that was that was the name for the Portuguese name for this group of people. They were named
uh,
explorers, but their job was actually slave hunting.
fair
uh,
enough.
they expand Brazil far out beyond the Treaty of Tordesillas. They expand into Uruguay. They expand into Colombia. They expand into Peru. And this is just a disorganized mob rush of slave raids. And they get kicked all the way back to what is now the modern boundaries of Brazil. They kind of get cupped in by the seas and the mountains. When the Spanish military, hearing about all these raiders coming in and stealing their exploitable human resource,
Human capital.
yep, decide to launch a series of counterattacks that end in a number of treaties: 1750 Treaty of Madrid, 1761 Treaty of Pardo, and 1777 Treaty of Ildefonso,
I
which
think
establishes set borders with Spain that are undisputed.
I also think it's very important to highlight at this point in time the level of expertise in warfare plus the resources available. Spain has been long entrenched in the new world at this time. They have resources, networks, trade, like they have established themselves fully and rooted, whereas in Brazil it's not to the same degree.
Yeah, yeah, and that is why when Portugal and Spain are technically unified under one crown, all of Spain's enemies attack the Portuguese colonies because that's the weak spot. The crown disunifies, and the Portuguese settlers immediately just start going ham on their Spanish neighbor because loyalty lasts as long as the paper does.
Oh Jesus. They are
Yeah,
a very tenacious group of settlers. I will give them that. They
yeah,
are
yeah,
destined to try and make their bag.
yeah. And we come to now the last person of the colonial period of Brazil here, Joseph I, King of Portugal, who puts together a number of major reforms with his Prime Minister Pombal. Those are actual names. I can't say anything, but
Pombal. Oh,
yeah.
that's a weird name
Uh,
anyways.
num- Number one, indigenous people have human rights.
What?
Number two, all Jesuits are expelled
Oh no.
on grounds of profiteering from human labor in the Adelaide system. You'll notice that the slaveholders of the sugar plantations aren't expelled because at this point they've transitioned to Africans, which are not recognized by this reform.
Oh
Yay!
Jesus.
Selective racism.
Yeah, especially profiteering selective racism.
Yep. Uh, they further attempt to centralize the Brazilian government through these reforms because these colonies have strong regional variations and are on the brink of warfare with themselves most of the time. Uh, these colonies are held together by exactly four things: the Portuguese language, trading exclusively with Portugal by law, uh, the shared economic and cultural dependence created by the first two factors, and a very distinct identity of being not the Spanish.
You know, we're bad, but at least we're not those guys. At least we didn't do what the Spanish did.
Brazil is a colony encompassed on three sides by a single power, the Spanish. Thus, being not them tends to be a very defining factor.
Yeah, I can respect that. At
Yep.
least I'm not him.
Yep. Yep. Um, they really only make four cities in this colonial period. Urban development is not a priority. The only real cities that develop are Salvador, Rio de Janeiro, uh, Recife, and Ouro Preto. And that's it for what is a massive country that has 15 separate segments of 160 miles of coastline. You built four cities.
Yeah, it takes a lot of manpower. It takes good location. You have to make sure it's sustainable.
Yeah, but this is 170 some years you built four cities. Um, and with that, we're going to come into the Empire of Brazil. This is the good stuff, the stuff we promised you. So the first inkling that Portugal may not hold Brazil as a colony comes in 1789 when a man known as the Tooth Puller, Tiradentes, starts a rebellion against Portugal.
Woo, rebellion!
The Portuguese execute him for this, and it works about as well as throwing Christians to lions.
Yay,
He's immediately
martyrdom!
elevated to the state of martyr and is basically a de facto national hero for anyone interested in Portuguese or Brazilian independence from Portugal.
God, we love martyrs in here.
Yeah. Um, then in 1807, Napoleon invades Portugal during the Napoleonic Wars because Portugal made the decision to decide with the British and not the French. Um, this goes rather poorly for Portugal because it's Napoleon. And the Prince Regent and later King John VI flees to Brazil. And this makes Brazil the only colony to serve as the seat of governance for its mother country, as the government of Portugal is now being run out of Brazil.
Interesting.
Yeah. Because of this, um, Brazil is granted certain rights, namely the right to trade with countries other than Portugal and the right to manufacture goods. These two things were usually banned by colonial powers on account of giving your colony self-sustainability and, the ability to trade with your enemies tends to make them really question why they need you.
Yeah. Uh,
Yeah. Uh, Rio de Janeiro will serve as the
Rio de
capital for John the
Janeiro.
Sixth. I will say it how I say it.
I just
I
want
have
to try
vowel
and
shift.
I just want to give some of our Brazilian fans the respect that they deserve.
Yeah. Yes, yes. The John issues the decree of 1815, which proclaims the existence of the United Kingdom. This being the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. And this does one very important thing that's going to touch off a powder keg.
Uh-oh.
It puts Brazil in, at the very least, name only, on equal standing with Portugal. It is no longer a subservient colony. It is no longer a vassal state. It is an equal partner in this government.
So they gain some standing.
And Portugal does not like it.
Well, what do they do when they don't like
Well,
something? Let me guess. Do they try and revolt? Do they fight back?
well, in 1821, John VI has to leave Brazil in response to revolts in Lisbon and Oporto back
Oh,
home
I
in
knew it.
Portugal. Uh, he leaves his son, Dom Pedro, the future Emperor Pedro I, in charge of Brazil. And things only get worse for Brazil and Portugal from there on out. See, Brazil thinks it should be a republic. And the Cortes, the Parliament of Lisbon, thinks that Brazil should be a subservient colony. And the Parliament of Lisbon repeals John VI reforms,
Oh
making
God.
Brazil equal. and orders that Pedro, the heir apparent, return to Portugal to serve as, the heir apparent to the throne. Get out of this colony. What are you doing, in what the government has now declared to be a lesser state?
Also, is important to highlight the fact that by 1822, the powder keg of revolutions in this part of the world really started happening, and you started seeing these revolts and these calls for independence spring up across countries from North America all the way down to South America. I mean, the United States independence was barely 50 years prior to this, and that was a big movement in regards to the shift to freedom.
Yep. Um, so Pedro has absolutely no interest in responding to the Cortes at all. And on June 3rd, he invokes this legislative assembly uh, to sort of start crafting up what is essentially a constitution for Brazil. Naturally, with him as the head as emperor, of course. Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And on September 7th, he marches out with this independence, with this document for governments, to outside Sao Paulo. And he gives a speech known as Fico, which is the I am staying speech, where he declares that he will not return to Portugal. Brazil is an independent nation. Nay, Brazil is an empire. And
Wait,
on December 1st, he is crowned Emperor of Brazil.
so let me get this straight, okay? Pedro is the son of John the Sixth,
Yep.
and then he then declares Brazil an independent nation and becomes the emperor of Brazil,
Yep.
effectively going from monarch to emperor.
Yeah. Yeah. Instead of being king of Portugal, he becomes emperor of Brazil.
Interesting.
Yeah. And there is communication, I believe, between Pedro the First and John the Sixth, saying that if Brazil is to break from Portugal, I would rather you do this, and we keep the empire in the family, than see Portugal lose Brazil to some radical liberal revolution. Side eyes at America.
Not the first time Brazil looked at
Uh,
America as way too liberal.
uh, However, the United States becomes the first nation to ever recognize Brazil in 1824.
Which is not a unique trend with the United States. The United States, like I mentioned, during the period in which a lot of these nations became independent, this is all thanks to the Monroe Doctrine,
Yep.
which U.S. President James Monroe, the fourth U.S. president, set a doctrine that was like, all of these new countries on this side of the earth, yeah, if you attack them, we're going to help them out. Like, we
Yeah.
don't want no more European influence.
Yeah. And because the United States recognizes Brazil, this puts pressure on Portugal, which in 1825 relents and recognizes Brazil as an independent country. And this allows all the other European powers to do the same, because Europe is really not recognizing Brazil sort of as a means of keeping the peace with Portugal. Portugal says this is their colony. We're going to acknowledge that, because Portugal lives right next door to the rest of Europe, and no one wants a war on their own turf.
But it's also a really important thing to note that for countries to gain independence and to gain prominence on the national stage, you need that recognition. That's why it's such a big step when a country recognizes a new country, because then that offers a sense of legitimacy. Yeah. However, this can also be weaponized, and in modern context, that's part of the conflict in Ukraine. I mean, Russia is recognizing two breakaway republics.
Why are we bringing this up now?
Because it's a modern relevant
21st century could not be involved in our history texts.
They're very, there's a lot of
I know there's a parallel. It's a good analogy. It's just I'm trying not to bring modern politics into this.
I didn't state any sort of position on it. I just stated facts that there are two breakaway republics that are being recognized.
It's just I get worried when we start talking about 21st anything past the Cold War. I just get worried when we start doing that. Yes, it's a very thin line to toe.
And that is my
Um,
job to toe that line.
your job's to give me a heart attack.
Exactly.
Um, so Pedro the First, not the best man to be suited to the crown. I'm just gonna say it. He is impulsive, he is arbitrary, and he believes in absolute authority. um, there are a series of regional revolts that go out against Pedro's authority. These revolts um, are not helped by the fact that in 1823, he disbands the Constitutional Assembly for being too unwilling to listen to him and, in his mind, too radical. Keep in mind, Brazil wants a republic. He is an emperor. So there's that clash.
Yeah, a bit of a
And
paradox.
he sends one of the most prominent and powerful men of the time, the ministry head, Andrada de Silva, and his brothers into exile from Brazil.
Ooh,
So
we can.
he just casts out his entire support network from the legislative half of his government.
But that is a true consolidation of power.
Yep.
Honestly, true to most
Yep.
empires of like, oh, anyone that even remotely dissents with me?
Yep.
Okay, goodbye. Oh, people who can contend against my power using religion or family lineage? Ah, you're gone too.
What he does is he writes a new constitution. This constitution does several things. It is simultaneously very authoritarian. It strengthens the powers of the emperor. It basically allows Pedro to declare whatever he wants whenever he wants, for the most part. But it also acknowledges more sort of civil liberties than most any other constitution for its time, especially for a constitutional monarchy, which this empire is. It acknowledges the rights of people in ways that no one really did in the early 19th century. Um, uh, in 1824, all the municipal councils, all those little what we in the United States would consider state governments, all the little federative states of the Brazilian Empire, uh, green light this constitution that the emperor told them the green light, and it becomes law. This constitution would actually last throughout the entirety of the imperial period. This is their constitution. There is no tear it up and build again by any successor or foreign state. It lasts until there is no empire of Brazil.
Interesting.
However, Pedro's popularity collapses under the weight of his own personality.
For a very interesting reason, too. We talked about this a little pre recording, and it's a beautiful little paradox. Because of our conversation about modern parallels, do you remember the old Skittles commercial of the walking contradictions?
Nope. I love you say we talked about this beforehand. Didn't talk about that, did you?
No, but we talked about how he was a paradox because one of the things that he was that caused this was he was simultaneously too liberal but also too authoritarian at the exact same time. Like
That's
literally
what
a walking
simultaneously means.
but I mean like literally a walking contradiction. Someone whose policies and his actions went almost entirely against each other.
Yep. And some of those policies are various things. So the first thing that goes up against him that really sandbags him in this is he loses what is now Uruguay to Argentina in a bloody and what is viewed as futile war. So he's not showing great military strength by losing this war, and that's not good for an authoritarian government.
But then he appointed some Mazombos, which are Brazilian Creoles, to high office.
This
So I mean,
becomes deeply unpopular for the opposite reason of being too
liberal.
willing to, too liberal. He's too much of a meritocracy. He's too willing to appoint people who can do the job well rather than people whose grandfather did the job well.
Which is a really interesting paradox because considering a country wanting to be a republic, this is a great thing. However, when you're talking a Creole population, especially in a lot of these previously racist contexts, or like currently racist, if we're going to be honest, of like mixed bloods coming into.
Yep. Yeah. 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 Coming into power. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a big problem. And the issue for this is Brazil's population is dividing into two factions. First are the wealthy plantation owners who want to rule as mini kings in their own right. And
What nationality do they tend to be?
they're the Portuguese Brazilians.
Yeah.
And also largely Portuguese Brazilians as well, who are this sort of city dwelling middle class. These are the liberal Republican idealists. And so any action that would please one displeases the other because one group is out there calling for civil liberties and democracy, and the other group is basically trying to rule like this is medieval Europe and they are barons. They're just trying to be robber barons, and that's over high of it. He is also given his direct ties and the fact that his father is sitting on the throne of Portugal, he's considered too closely tied with Portugal. And he does spend a lot of time tending to affairs that deal with the Portuguese. So he's considered too Portuguese for the Portuguese colony.
God. Understandably so. They're trying to get freedom. They're trying to break away from it to have that legacy connection. I could see there being some issues.
Additionally, he's seen as ineffective because no one can get along with this man for long because he constantly fights with his own legislature. He constantly believes he is the only one who could be right.
I don't have that issue.
Yes,
Neither do you.
And finally, he did two more things, and that really sunk the ship for him, and that is the British and the British. So first and foremost, he how do I put this? He made some trade agreements with the Kingdom of Great Britain to basically say, when your ships come to port, we won't tax you as much. Port taxes was a big source of income in Brazil. So by keeping those duties low, he pissed off all the people in the city and he pissed off the rich people who were looking to make a buck. Additionally, as part of this agreement with the British for the trade duties, he promised the eventual abolition of the slave trade. Now, to be clear, this is not the abolition of slavery in Brazil. This is the abolition of importing slaves, the right to buy and sell. This is deeply unpopular with all those rich people in the sugar plantations for obvious reasons that are obvious. No one likes having their own labor undercut.
Yeah, and I was going to say, you go into a fast food place and you start paying people like $30 an hour and they all start quitting. You're going to go, hey, I don't like this policy. I don't like these people getting a better deal.
Yep. And this all culminates in April 7th, 1831, where he abdicates in favor of his son, Emperor Pedro II.
Which, how old was Pedro II? Was he like 18, ready to rule?
He seizes power at the wizened old age of 5 years. This plan was not thought through. And it very clearly is not thought through because from 1831 to 1835, the first 4 years of Pedro II's regency.
So from 5 years old to 9.
Yeah. There's a triple regency, which is sort of no one man can assume power on behalf of the emperor. So a sort of a triumvirate of 3 men attempt to do so. They are not good at it. They cannot control the military, and rogue units do whatever the hell they want, whenever they want, without consequence. They cannot prevent the provinces of Brazil from declaring war on one another and actually
Oof.
fighting said wars. And finally, crime is rampant. They cannot administer law in their own territory. There is no rule of law.
Gee,
It's petty
something's got to
despots.
change.
So in 1834, they sign an amendment. They create an amendment to the Constitution that says there can be a sole regent elected to a 4-year term. Um, Additionally, to make governing easier, all those provincial assemblies that had to ratify this constitution under the threat of Pedro the First, um, they get a lot of their power back.
Oh
There's
no.
a decentralization of just, all right, I'm done. You deal with it. Y'all figure this out for yourself. It's an attitude of it doesn't matter who answers to who, so long as you all answer to me.
Sometimes that works best. I mean, it worked for a lot of Roman areas of like,
Yeah,
as long as you guys just send legionnaires and you
yeah,
bow down to Rome, you're good.
yeah. That's the mentality here. However, this is still only a stopgap measure. And at 1840, the people of Brazil hate this regency. There's deep frustration. It's incompetent, it's bureaucratic, it doesn't consider anyone's interest or issues. But they believe that this will all be solved when their glorious young emperor seizes power for himself, steps into the limelight, all their problems will go away.
That's a lot of hope for a young kid.
Yep. And that is why on July 23rd, 1840, the Parliament of Brazil declares Pedro II emperor, declaring that he has reached adulthood and is capable of ruling
At what age?
at
14?
at 14 years old.
I am 14. Oh, my voice squeaked.
Yeah.
I am
Yes.
emperor.
Yes. Yes. The world has yet to make a man who is not who lacks the patience for absolute power. um, Pedro II rules from 1840 to 1889,
Wow.
and he is regarded as an enlightened ruler, a statesman, and an intellectual. And his single greatest lament throughout his entire reign is, as he himself remarks, is if only I could have been a school teacher.
Oh my God. So
That is legitimate. His favorite part of his job was going around and opening new schools.
So he ended up like it went from disarray and from him being given the throne at a
Yeah.
young age to him actually turning out to be a pretty competent
Yeah.
person.
And one of the big things to this is he has a man who I'm just using the last part of his name for this, Lima E. Silva, who is the son and grandson of several other prominent Lima E. Silvas. This one uh, stamps out the regional revolts of the 1840s and is basically Pedro II's right hand man as minister.
You really
Um,
have to have a good second in
this
command. The
this
hand of the king.
this guy is his hammer. This is a competent military general, and Lima de Silva, Lima E Silva shows it.
Honestly, though,
Um,
that's a good system to have. You have the enlightened leader who is very open and very like knowledgeable, who's good about things, but then also has someone who's equally as competent in military matters, but
yeah,
as
and is
loyal as could
actually
be.
loyal to him.
That's the important part.
Yeah. And this gets put on full display in the War of the Triple Alliance, which begins in 1864 and runs to 1870. So it's a pretty long war. And what happens in this is Brazil is eyeing up Uruguay, which they lost under Pedro I. Only Pedro II, he's a little smarter than his father. He sees indirect control as a great way of empire building rather than just constant territorial expansion. So he decides during the Uruguayan Civil War to just sort of put his finger on the scales and tip it inside of one that would favor him. Someone that will be in debt to him, someone whose policies would favor him. This is empire building. This is imperialism.
Yeah.
Paraguay terrified of Brazilian influence rising, overreacts. And not only do they intervene in this proxy war in Uruguay, they declare war on Brazil itself and anyone who sides with the opposing faction in Uruguay,
So you mean like Argentina?
which includes Argentina. Now, some of you more familiar with maps may notice that Brazil and Argentina are magnitudes larger than Paraguay. and they can attack it from multiple angles.
So
This is not a winning strategy.
Let me guess. Brazil and Argentina invade, and they manage to completely control Paraguay.
They completely overthrow the Paraguayan government.
Oh no!
It is annihilated. And I just want to point out, this is the bloodiest war in South American history. So when I say they overthrew the government, I mean no one is left.
That is like trying to throw a rock at your neighbor's house and ended up burning your own house to the ground.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that is a misstep by Paraguay if I've ever seen one.
However, this bloody war and Paraguay's disastrous folly does actually reap some very interesting human rights consequences for Brazil.
Okay, let's hear them.
So number one, this war really centralized military power under the government of Brazil, which means all those provinces that got all these new like civil administration capabilities back, they no longer have the ability to really recapture slaves that flee across provincial boundaries. So there is freedom. Additionally, because of how bloody and horrific this war is, calls for a republic begin to rise.
Oh no.
People have been sent off to a foreign war for the sake of imperialism, and they have died horribly. They have massacred armies. They themselves have been massacred. War is hell, and Brazil for 6 years knew it. And this rising tension begins to crystallize around a single issue: slavery. Because it's always slavery. And one of the big things is real political power in Brazil does not sit with the absolute monarch of the emperor, enlightened or otherwise. It does not sit with the commander of the military, be he for a province or the central government. It does not sit with the people of the ports and the cities. It sits with the plantation owners. They alone control the economy of Brazil. They alone control its politics. And they alone shall be blamed for this war.
Not Sugar to mention, being horrible people and enslaving others for monetary purposes, but, I digress.
People resonate with issues when it hurts them directly. This is a catalyst. Sugar and coffee plantations are responsible for the Brazilian economy in its entirety. And the people who own these slaves, because of this wealth and power, are completely insulated from any form of criticism, both within Brazil and from the growing global sentiment that owning people is bad and you shouldn't do it. They do not care. They are laughing in the face of this rising tide of anti-slavery sentiment. And active agitation begins in the 1860s as this War of the Triple Alliance is wreaking havoc over in Uruguay. Pedro II himself is against slavery. He does not like this institution. He is an enlightened ruler. But so powerful are the plantation owners that he fears an all-out rebellion against his rule should he dissolve it. But Pedro is enlightened, so he tries to be clever about this. He is not clever enough.
Oh.
He decides to start with the 1871 Law of the Free Womb. Since importing slaves is already banned thanks to the deal that Pedro I struck with the United Kingdom, Pedro II decides to kill it within a generation by making any child born to a slave born a free citizen of Brazil.
That's interesting. It's like your parents are screwed, but hey, at least you get a fresh lease on life. Like, congrats.
Mm-hmm. Now, his hope was that he could condemn slavery to a slow death, and by forcing it to be a slow death, avoid civil war from these wealthy, powerful magnates that could very easily fund major revolutions against the government. However, naturally, the abolitionists are not satisfied. They continue to agitate. In 1884, the provinces of Ceará and Amazonas abolished slavery entirely.
Wow.
In 1885, the Brazilian government frees all slaves over 60. The idea here being there's no new labor coming in. The slaves over 60 aren't going to live if they have to work the cotton fields like some 30-year-old person. Let's put a retirement age on slavery.
So this was 14 years after the law of the free womb. So
Yeah.
from what 15 to 59 is the dwindling age of most slaves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting.
This is getting rid of those. This is allowing those who make it to the point where they are no longer useful field labor
Yeah.
to escape just being discarded like you would a broken spoon. They get to be people, and this is once again trying to just squeeze out slavery as much as they can without starting a war.
Like, look, I'm not outright outlawing it.
Yeah. Yeah, you can't rebel. You don't have a single point, you don't have a single thing to point to that says he's gone too far, he's a madman, we have to stop him. There is no single law that does this. It's about beating them down slowly. However, this is naturally still not enough. And in 1888, Isabel, the Princess Regent of Brazil, is able to make a declaration her father cannot. She is able to declare emancipation without compensation for all slaves in Brazil. She is able to strike that death blow.
Which is it's a good thing that they were freed, but it really aggravates me that whole like without compensation. Like, yep, sorry you were enslaved. Sorry people owned
No, no,
you.
no, 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 no. That's not what that means, Justin.
No.
No, without compensation to the slave owners. See,
So they don't pay for them.
a common policy for getting rid of slavery is the idea of we will pay you slightly over market share for the slaves you own if you agree to free them.
So
With
they would
this,
basically buy them out.
it wasn't. Usually it's you buy them out as a means of preventing the slave owners from going to war with you. This just straight up said, no, you're horrible people. You get nothing. You lose everything. Get out.
You get nothing.
That's what that means, Justin. Without we do not give the bad people money. This is the logic is, if a bad person offers you money, you take it so that the bad person will have less money.
But the question is, the good people didn't get money, and that's the issue.
No, they did not. There was no means set up to monetarily compensate the slaves. The best that they could really do was free them and just never pay the slaveholders for it because they're not property. I'm not destroying your property. There's no property to destroy. These are people. Go away. What twisted logic is this that I have to pay you for them? And this act after all these other acts, so no children for 17 years can be born a slave. No slave can be imported to Brazil for decades. And no one over 60 can be a slave. This act in 1888 still frees 700,000 people. Yeah, we're talking about incremental measures. Meet what was missed by the increment. As good as those measures were, as much as it slowed down the ability of these slaveholders to start a war, as much as it prevented mass bloodshed on this issue, like you see in so many other countries, still kept over 500,000 people in bondage for nearly 20 years.
Oh. That's not very good. There's not much I can really say about that. That's just awful.
Yep. Now, all of this build up here, all this, tiptoeing around slavery, all of this is going to come to a head 1 year later in 1889. But before we jump into that, it is worth noting that Pedro II is an enlightened ruler, and he did more things than just tiptoe around the slavery issue for 40 years. Pedro did a lot to make sure that Brazil prospered. He invested heavily in its infrastructure. He laid down 5,000 miles of railroad. He increased the value of Brazil's exports tenfold. He increased the revenue of for the government by 14-fold, just from imports, taxation, regulation, from actually having good management. The government had surplus of money. They could do things. They could be a good government. And here's an important thing. He increased the population of Brazil by 10 million people. Now, remember how I said a minute ago that there were 700,000 slaves in Brazil?
Yeah.
So, by the end of his reign, there are 14 million people in Brazil. At the start of it, there were 4. At the end of his reign, there are 700,000 people who were enslaved. That's a significant chunk of the population. That's 1 in 14 people are a slave in this country. That is
Wow.
That is massive. That is massive. That is a death plague level statistic of just how bad something is.
That is a starkingly high number.
Yep. Well, Brazil was not a populous country. It's a land of large forested territory and rural plantations. There's very few dense population centers.
Jeez.
And so, Pedro does all these good things. Education is on the rise. He establishes schools. This man knows how to administer for art and science and just general good sense. But he cannot, through politics mostly, destroy slavery fast enough to save his empire. Because in 1889, despite all the successes and all the prosperity, despite the fact that slavery is finally, mercifully dead, the people are angry. He's moved too slow. There's too much tension between the urban, republic idealed, liberal middle class and this wealthy, landed aristocracy that is slowly losing everything. And Pedro finds himself with absolutely no friends. The military and the wealthy and the landed elite hate him for all his reforms, for how liberal he's being, for destroying their, mercantile way of life.
Yeah, we were just business owners. It's not like we were doing something that was ethically fucking awful.
They were very much. So very much. And then all these urbanites in the middle class feel that this monarchy is too tied up with the elites. They're too concerned with what the elites want, what the elites will do, with what the elite money says. And the general populace comes to feel that a republic would better respond to the needs of Brazil and the Brazilian people. And that's where a really unusual alliance is formed. Because reaching out across the lines here, the military, which was very conservative with the landed elites, and a lot of these urban middle class people who are very liberal and want a republic, both come to an agreement in their mutual dissatisfaction with how the government is run. And the military agrees to overthrow the empire of Brazil and put a republic in its place. A republic that these urban middle class people will feel will respond to their needs and actually govern Brazil for all of Brazil and not just these elites. And a republic that this military thinks it can dominate. Because the military has been losing influence against Pedro.
Of course.
And so, on November 15th, 1889, military officers commit a coup. And Pedro II chooses exile and abdicates his throne. He will spend the rest of his life in Europe.
So it goes full circle.
Yep. And the Republic of Brazil is born. It should be noted that this is not the Federative Republic of Brazil that we know and love today. This is an early republic, and it goes through a number of, shall we say, phases that we will not get into. Various constitutions, amendments, attempted coups, pseudo dictators, and other such things. It is, it is another long 140-year journey to get here, but they get here. And that is the end of the Empire of Brazil. And it really is a thematic end, Justin, if you think about it. Because up until Brazil becomes a republic, two things have defined it: monarchy and slavery. And in 2 years, both are dead.
It's almost like they were not mutually exclusive. You need one to succeed, but without one another, they're both destined to fail.
I would not say that. I would say in the case of Brazil, destroying slavery brought down the monarchy. But monarchs do not necessarily require slaves, and enslavement does not necessarily require monarchs.
Oh, no. I was purely talking in a Brazilian context.
I want to make that very clear, given the flag that flies behind your screen, Justin.
God bless America.
Glory, glory, hallelujah. That's a wrap, folks.
Yeah. If you guys enjoyed today's episode, be sure to drop a like down below. Be sure to follow us on the platform you're listening to so you don't miss any future episodes. And be sure to leave a comment. If you have any really strong thoughts that you have about the episode, whether positive or negative, if you have suggestions about any future content, please let us know. We are more than willing to take suggestions. We just got to let us know what you are interested in. We can cater to the masses.
Yep.
And we will pander as much as we can.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and for those of you watching this, coming up on our schedule, we have for HH Reads, first, the poem High Flight from the Second World War. And then we have the Ballad of the White Horse from, I believe it is just before World War I. So we're doing some 20th century poetic literature this month, which we hope you will enjoy on our most underwatched channel. I'm not dying inside, I swear.
On top of that, in 2 weeks, we will also be dropping the Bhopal gas tragedy, which is Also coincides with the autumn equinox, so kind of interesting. Be sure to
Yeah.
check that out. That drops on what, the 21st? Or is
That will drop
no? Yep,
on
the
the
19th.
19th, Justin.
Yep,
Yeah,
September
yep.
19th.
Yeah, the dates shown are the dates they drop, not the dates we
Okay.
make them. Yeah.
So yeah, that drops 9/19. So be sure to check that out, and then also be sure to give our other series a watch. Obviously, Colum gave you the lineup for HH Read, so be sure to check those out. And then for our HH Explains, we've got a couple of really interesting ones coming up. Like we've got one about the tragedy of 9/11 that should be dropping later next week.
Yeah.
Later this week, actually, it'll be
Yeah,
on
later.
the 7th.
Yeah, we'll drop on the 7th, just 2 days after this podcast comes out. And I can't believe you made me write for the 21st century.
Look, there are historic events that happen consistently. We shouldn't bias ourselves purely to the ancient past, or we
It's
should look
not
at
the
some
ancient.
recent past. We should look at the recent past too,
We're
because there's a
getting
lot of.
we get into politics too easily.
Yes, you're right, but we should separate that and just talk about the historical events because
This
9/11,
is
I think, was a genesis moment in modern history.
It was. It was. I'm not disputing that. Those of you listening to this are witnessing the current war for the soul of historical humans. Please type down the name of whichever host you think should win this war. If you
Hashtag
type,
Team Justin.
yeah, uh, if you type my name, history will view you favorably.
History shall look back on me kindly, for I intend to write it. Sir Winston Churchill. But
Yes,
on
that's
that
very nice.
glorious bombshell, that is a wrap for this episode. Thank you guys for watching, and be sure to check out our other episodes. We'll see you guys next time.